Good evening and welcome. The participants are still joining in, but we have to start now. On behalf of my colleagues at SSCR, I would like to welcome all of you to this very important and timely lecture by Professor Surajit Mazumdar. Professor Mazumdar is going to speak on an issue that all of us are aware of. It's 5 years since demonetization happened in India. And we all are aware of the various, the changing goalposts, the claims that were initially made, the claims of unaccounted money and corruption and so on, terrorism, cleaning the system of counterfeit currency and so on. And then we moved on to cashless economy, digitization of the economy, digitalization, and so on. And finally, the formalization of the economy, the increase of the tax base and so on. So there were many claims made. We are 5 years into these, the claims, and we all are aware of the immediate extreme difficulties that were faced by the economy, by common people when demonetization was declared. And then we were told that there would be some long-term benefits. 5 years is not really long-term, perhaps, we don't know. To get a sense of what has happened since and the havoc that was created by demonetization, the long-term effects and what the impact it has had on India and on our economy and on our lives. We have today with us Professor Surajit Mazumdar. Professor Surajit Mazumdar doesn't need any introduction. All of us know him. He is Professor of Economics at the Center for Economic Studies and Planning at JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's a dear friend and a supporter of all activities here at SSCR. We welcome him. I welcome him on behalf of the audience. And Professor Mazumdar will speak for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes, as long as he wants. And then we will have a question answer session. I request the audience to place their questions in the chat box. We will collect the questions. And depending on how it goes, we will have a question answer session at the end of the lecture. Okay. So with these few words, I now welcome, I request Professor Mazumdar to begin his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Jassim. Given my, as in Jassim indicated, association with the SECR, I can't really thank the SECR for this invitation to come and speak today on this subject, having in a sense been part of a whole formulation of an idea to do this thing. But I would like to thank Jassim, Vikas and all for accepting that it is an occasion on which something needs to be done. And I will thank everyone who has found the time to come and listen to me, because I'm the only speaker today. So there are no other attractions that they found the time to come and listen to me speak on this subject. I'd like to thank everyone for that. We are, of course, looking at this question of demonetization 5 years after the announcement was first made. Almost just we are only 2 days past that 5 years. This 5 years having passed this occasion has, to an extent in the public discussion, in the media discussions, revived discussion on an issue which appeared to be, till then, fading into the background, having been overshadowed by several other subsequent developments or events that have taken place. But this overshadowing is, in a sense, perhaps was unfortunate because the things that are overshadowing that event of 5 years ago, demonetization, and demonetization may not be so completely delinked from each other as I would like to argue today. Because I would like to today, in this discussion, try and place an understanding of the demonetization episode in an important episode in India's economic history. With this in mind, we are actually talking about it 5 years since that event. Okay. And we need not 5 years from that point of time. We need not limit our discussion to what was feasible or possible at the time that the announcement or decision was made, executed, implemented, and directly experienced by the citizens of India. Of course, while assessing, some bit of what was discussed or said at that time will come up, but I will today try and limit that part and try and focus more on how, when we look back on that 5 years down the line, what does it tell us about the phase in India's economic history, which in a sense, I would argue that it marked the entry of India into a distinct phase of its economic history, even within the larger phase of what is called the liberalization or the neoliberal era, even within this particular decade, which has been a period of relative economic difficulties compared to the previous one. Even within that, it in a sense marked some kind of a transition to a new phase in India's economic history. That's what is something that I will try and develop through the course of this lecture. So going back, this is of course what the dramatic announcement that happened on 8th November 2016. This is from the transcript of the Prime Minister's announcement on television, where you can, of course, recall, as Jasim was indicating, there was a very clear focus that this was a historic, very decisive measure that the government was taking against corruption, black money, and terrorism, okay, and fake currency. With, of course, a particular focus on black money or the black economy. This was something that was the way in which the measure was announced and rationalized or justified. And people were told that for this larger good that this would give rise to, some temporary pain would have to be accepted. This, the Ministry of Finance's press release also more or less said the same thing, which was issued on the same date, and with again particular focus on the black economy or the shadow economy. And the Ministry of Finance's press release even gave a figure to what might be the size of that particular shadow economy, and it gave a figure which it derived from a World Bank estimate. It was a figure that, when the latest figure available in that was for 2007, and the implicit understanding was that since then it had grown even further. Okay, so the understanding that was put forward was that the demonetization measure, in which the legal tender character of certain high denomination notes, which accounted for 86% of the total currency in the economy, that legal tender status was eliminated, and that measure was clearly justified primarily as a measure of dealing with the black or the shadow economy. With regard to other aspects of it, several things have been discussed. For example, the matter of fake currency. Most people would be aware that even the several studies had shown that the proportion of fake currency in the economy was hardly of a size which would justify this kind of a measure. On the other hand, with regard to the question of terrorism, I recall at that point of time several supporters of the move, political supporters of the move, saying it has broken the backbone of terrorism. In a sense, the government itself admitted that no such backbone had been broken before the 2019 elections, when in the way in which it portrayed the attack in Pulwama. Okay. So if the backbone of terrorism had been broken, then of course in 2016 November or thereabouts, then in 2019, perhaps you would not have seen the kind of incident that you saw, of which, again, the government made a lot out of, that it was a very big event. The government itself said, it's not my words, that it was a very big attack on the thing, on India. And of course, there have been several others before that, and I doubt whether anyone will be able to empirically ever establish that the incidence of, or the problem of terrorism has been in any sense decisively affected by that demonetization measures in the 5 years since that measure was taken. So the main, of course, focus, however, was on this whole question of the shadow economy and the black economy. And people were told that, okay, one of the important implications of this is that the government loses a lot of revenue. And this revenue, if it comes to the government, could be used for welfare and developmental activities, which would benefit the people. Okay, so for this short-term pain, you should expect that in the future, you would get the benefits in terms of greater expenditure by the government on such welfare and development activities. The Gazette notification, which was the official notification of that demonetization, was also something that talked about same things: the fake currency, unaccounted wealth, subversive activities like drug tracking and terrorism. And of course, it mentioned the specific power under the RBI Act, which was invoked for that particular decision of withdrawing the legal tender status of 500 and 1,000 rupee notes. So it is clear from these things that if you look at the Gazette notification, the PM speech on that date, if you look at the Finance Ministry press release, there is a common narrative there about what is the objective that is being targeted with this demonetization. Jasim referred to the question of shifting goalposts. Of course, there was then added to this the whole thing that this was part of a move to shift towards kind of away from cash to digital transactions, etc. This was to promote the use of digital transactions, formalization. So many things were later said. But here was this clear message, which at the beginning was clear what the focus was being made of this demonetization measure. Now, there was an assessment about the demonetization measure, which someone who is considered one of the topmost economists of the world was a co-author of, which appeared a few months after the demonetization announcement. And here I have put down the first and the last passages of that article, which appeared in Times of India on 8th of April 2017. The first passage, as you can see, is something that stood out in a sense that demonetization was one measure which was special or unique amongst economic policy measures taken by the government, because on the question of demonetization itself, you saw a rare unanimity amongst economists that this is a measure that would have disruptive effects on the economy, and that unanimity was based on the fact that it is very simple. A very simple undergraduate level macroeconomics would tell you that there would be such a disruptive effect of the withdrawal of legal tender status of 86% of the country's currency. So even if you were not particularly deeply knowledgeable about the intricacies of India's economy and unorganized sector, cash economy, black economy, etc., and all of that, you could understand that the effects would be disruptive. And the benefits in relation to what were the stated objectives, to most economists, they appear to be likely to be very minimal. Okay, so while there were differences in the way in which they articulated it, almost everyone was skeptical about demonetization achieving anything positive, and the likelihood that the costs would be more than the benefits was something that almost most economists would accepted or were inclined towards that position. This was an exception. This opinion expressed by and endorsed by someone like Bhagwati was a exception. And I don't think Bhagwati himself would have ever found himself in such a situation where so many of his fellow economists would have disagreed with what he said. But this was the way it was looked at, an assessment that was made. I'm not sure, whether Professor Bhagwati and his colleagues have been doing this great study of this great economic experiment in modern history anymore after 2017. In the 5 years since the demonetization passed, I've not seen some significant study of the great benefits that this bold economic experiment did. I would rather, I'm somewhat measured in my language with regard to how I articulate my opposition to opposing views, perhaps far more measured than Professor Bhagwati himself. I am also aware of the fact that Professor Bhagwati is, of course, a big name in economics, and I certainly don't belong to that league. So I cannot use the language that they use to dismiss the critiques of the demonetization move. So I've put down their own language and would suggest that perhaps this, in the last, what they said at the end of that particular piece, and would suggest that perhaps even they might agree that this perhaps applies more to their commentary than to the ones when the critiques of the demonetization measure. Today, perhaps even they would have to accept that this comment perhaps applies more to them. So that's, of course, in relation to the discussion at that particular point of time. But what I want to do today is, as I said, I want to look at it somewhat differently from what one looked at that point of time, with the benefit of hindsight, incorporating into one's understanding of the demonetization event what has happened subsequently also, not just as a direct consequence of demonetization, but several other things that have happened since and how they all are linked up with that demonetization episode in the past. So as far as the outcomes in relation to stated objectives, I will briefly discuss these outcomes. And on this again, any reasonable assessment would show that in relation to the original stated objectives, the outcome has been pretty much zero and perhaps even negative, as we shall see shortly. But there is still an unsettled question, because the Supreme Court has not yet considered the matter and given its verdict on whether such a decision taken by the Government of India in 2016 was something legal at all or not. Was it something that was possible within the Indian constitutional framework? Because there was a challenge to its legality, but we haven't yet heard the Supreme Court come to a verdict on that question. Now, as far as demonetization itself is concerned, having not taken any decision at that point of time, having taken so long with regard to arriving at a decision on its legality, of course, any decision has been rendered meaningless as far as that particular act is itself concerned. There's nothing you can do to change about India's demonetization episode on the basis of any verdict today about its legality or constitutionality. But in the process of not arriving at a decision about it, maybe one is letting a certain understanding of what powers the state has or doesn't have continue to work. And I would suggest that there are subsequent measures of a similar nature which have also happened, one because of this fact that the boundaries to the powers of the state in such matters has not been. I would like to argue that the question of the legality of the demonetization decision goes beyond that particular decision, and it has a larger significance. And one can argue that there are several decisions that have followed after demonetization in the last 5 years, in which the same kind of fundamental question is involved about the limits of the powers of the state. And this brings me to the last point that I would be focusing on in this, which is that the demonetization decision, of course, had certain macroeconomic implications, but it followed on a set of economic problems that were already existing. But the aspect of which I would like to add to is the fact that the series of decisions that have followed since are indicative of something about the demonetization decision, where it reflected the emergence of an additional malaise in economic policy making or decision making in the country, okay, which has its special significance for the way the economy has proceeded in the last 5 years, and has its own significance for the direction that this economy is taking. That there is something new that is happening or taking place after the demonetization episode is something that I would like to focus on briefly in the course of my lecture. Okay. So let's, if you look at now the question of the effects of demonetization in relation to the outcomes in relation to its stated objectives. So in relation to GDP, the currency that is either in circulation or with the public, and for the non-economists, the difference between these two is simply the cash that is held by banks, the currency that is issued by the RBI, but held by banks. That's the difference between the currency in circulation and currency with the public. So either of these as a percentage of GDP are not less now than they were on the eve of demonetization. Okay, so as I was saying, that the currency in circulation or currency with the public as a percentage of GDP, you don't see that any dramatic change has actually happened before and after demonetization. And the same is true when you look at cash withdrawals from ATMs. So at any point of time, the quantity of currency that people are holding in India relative to the GDP has not changed at all as a result of the demonetization experiment. On the other hand, actually, but it goes beyond that, which is that, and this holding of currency seems to be maintaining that level despite the fact that other indications are there, or other data indicate the greater use of digital means for making payments. Okay, that data is also existing, which says that greater and greater use of digital means are being made by people in order to make payments. But what I would like to emphasize here is that if you look at the means, the holding by people of the means by which they make payments, and fundamentally, money means the ability to, money is the means of making payments. And if you see the means by which people have to make payments, that's basically currency with the public, plus the deposits that they have in banks, which can be used to make transfers from one account to another. Okay. So no matter what may be happening as far as digital transactions are concerned, fundamentally, there are only two ways in which you make payments. One is you transfer from your holding of currency to the one to whom you're making a payment to. So you will lose a little bit of the currency holding, someone else will gain. As far as the public itself is concerned, it'll remain the same. And the other is that you basically transfer from one bank account to another person's bank account. Okay, so the value in one person's bank account comes down, the value in another person's bank account goes up. And the combined means of these kind of methods of making payment, what is the stock of those that the public has, is what is defined by narrow money. But whether you look at narrow money and broad money, typically includes, apart from these deposits in banks from which you can make payments, Okay. Broad money also includes deposits, which theoretically are convertible into deposits from which you can make payments, but are not necessarily of that kind. Think of something like a fixed deposit that would be included in a definition of broad money. But essentially, whether you use digital means or other means, there are basically only two ways in which you make a payment. And digital means are often different modes by which you do the same thing. And the holding of that relative to GDP or the composition of it between that part which is currency and that part which is non-currency money holding doesn't seem to have changed at all or to any significant degree as a result of demonetization. So in this table, you look at 2019-20 and you look at 2011-12. How much a difference do you find between these two? Very little. So almost as far as the way in which people hold the means to make payments, that's remained essentially the same, even after this episode of demonetization. The reason I'm pointing this out is that demonetization is in a sense a slightly misleading expression, because demonetization means the end of money. It never meant the end of money. Money continues to be used, and money continues to be used in fundamentally the same forms as earlier, with the same kind of composition as earlier. That has not changed as a result of demonetization. Not only that, if you look at the denomination of this money, yes, 1,000 rupee notes were outlawed, 2,000 rupee notes were brought in. Within 500 and 2,000, there have been some changes over the last few years. But broadly speaking, the distribution of the notes and coins in circulation between high denomination currencies and low denomination has also remained more or less the same. And high denomination still continues to dominate the currency in circulation. That is something that again has not changed as a result of demonetization, whereas it was high denomination which was considered to be the real problem at that point of time, in terms of the way it was put, that high denomination currencies are what are used for black money, are used for illegal transactions, etc., etc. But the dominance of the currency with the public, of the dominance of high denomination currencies, is something that didn't change with demonetization. It has remained essentially the same. So both of these are telling you a story of hardly any change having taken place as a result of demonetization with regard to the actual holding and use of money by the public. There might be one change, of course, which is that if you are seeing this scenario where the currency with the public is remaining as a proportion of GDP the same, while non-currency transactions, digital transactions, are in a sense increasing even as a proportion of GDP. Even retail transactions through digital means are increasing. Then it might mean that a greater part of the currency with the public is lying idle now, not in circulation in the way, not in active use as it was as compared to the past, that more of the currency may be lying idle, and this may be actually more symptomatic of the conditions of the sectors which use currency intensively, the segments of the economy which use currency intensively. So people are withdrawing the same amounts from ATMs. They are holding the same quantum of currency, but the movement of that currency may be less than earlier. So in fact, so you were talking about people holding money as one form of holding illicit wealth. People may be actually holding more money now than actually using them as compared to the past. Using that currency, holding of currency may be more now than in the past. The other aspect of this table, which of course was talked about at the point of demonetization, was this: that if the currency in circulation was 12% of the country's GDP, this 12% itself, of course, was significantly less than the 24-25% of the GDP, which was supposed to constitute the shadow economy. So the income generated in that shadow economy, compared to in a full year, compared to that, the stock of money, that currency that was available was less than half. And this is in relation to 1 year's income generated in the shadow economy. So it was obvious from that itself that a large part of the illicit wealth, which is a wealth that was not generated only in that year, but wealth that would have been accumulated over a long period of time, simply could not have been held in the form of currency. It was a mathematical impossibility. Okay. And the reason why it's a mathematical impossibility is that there is a reason why money is there. When people hold money, people don't hold money typically to hold money. People either hold money in order to make transactions. That is, I hold a certain amount of money in order to be able to have with me what I need when I have to make a transaction. So it is money that is being, or currency that is being held only for the purposes of using it to make a certain purchase within a short period. So it is something that you're going to hold for a short period of time, and all currency therefore tends to be always circulating, changing hands continuously. You do not, so that's one possible use of the currency. The other possible use of the currency is in some activity which generates a return, where money is expended or used in a way where in return you get a larger sum. But that also involves spending that money or spending that currency, converting it to something else. One thing on which you can spend your money or currency is you can acquire some kind of assets that you do not. So when you spend, you can spend on your consumption, or you can save out of your income and spend on certain assets. And holding of currency represents only one form in which you could hold assets. But if you look at, and if you assume that the corporate sector is not really involved in the shadow economy, this is all what is called the household sector of the economy, in which that shadow economy exists. But even if you look at that particular sector, bulk of its income is spent on consumption. Of the part that is not spent on consumption, the part that takes the form of or additional holdings of currency is very small, because the holding of currency is probably the most stupid thing that anyone would do. In a world in which prices keep on increasing, the value of currency will always keep coming down. So you would always prefer to convert it into something whose price will appreciate. Even if you're holding it as an asset, you're not consuming it. So the bulk of what constitutes the black income actually always got spent, and it was again and the part that could have potentially taken the form of simply holding on to large quantum of currency was always very small. But what you see is actually that has not come down, that has increased. The proportion of currency in the savings of households has actually increased. Again, a reflection of the fact that currency is not in active circulation to the same extent as earlier. It's there, but it is not in active circulation. And therefore, the proportion of currency in the financial savings of households actually has shown a tendency to be higher than it was before demonetization. I'm leaving aside what happened in 2016 and 2017-18. So 2016-17, because of the demonetization, you have a dip, and then you have a recovery of that in 2017-18. So 2016-17, 17-18 are two completely opposite trend pictures. But then it returns to what would be the normal pattern. And in that normal pattern, you do not see any indication that the holding of currency even as an asset has actually come down. Okay. So for some reason, instead of reducing the holding of currency or hoarding of currency in the economy, the demonetization exercise seems to have, at least as a correlation, you can say, seems to have increased the holding of currency, idle nature of currency in the economy to a certain degree. Now, so this, of course, the figures that you see here for 2015-16 was also known before demonetization. And it is this, that simply the mathematical impossibility of a significant part of black income or black wealth being held in the form of currency. Because this was known before the demonetization exercise was undertaken, it was that demonetization would not produce a major hit on the black economy, on the shadow economy, was something that was entirely predictable. You did not require data from what happened in order to be able to say that, which is why most economists who are aware of these, this is not high-level economics, this is pretty simple economics from which people understood that the claimed benefits in terms of denting on the black economy was not likely to happen. Because you knew beforehand that simply it was mathematically impossible for a significant part of the shadow wealth or black wealth and the black incomes to be held in the form of currency, even if the entire currency was held by the so-called black income earners and black wealth holders. Even if the entire currency was held by them, it would not have constituted anything more than a small part of the total black wealth which would have been accumulated over a period of time. Now, but what we didn't know at that point of time was how much of that, once the decision was taken to withdraw the legal tender status, and everyone, in order to be able to retain the purchasing power of that particular currency, would have to deposit it in a bank and convert it to new notes. Once, how much of the currency holding would actually get deposited this way is something that we did not know at that point of time. And in the Supreme Court, the government had actually argued that it didn't expect that the entire currency will actually come back, because naturally, if you think that there are holders of black wealth who hold it in the form of currency, then if they don't put it back into the banks, then that wealth will be destroyed. But if they do put it into the banks, then you'll know that they have it. So their anonymity would be lost. The anonymity that is associated supposedly with cash would be lost, and you would then be able to ensure that they pay the taxes that they are supposed to pay. So either way, they would lose out. If they didn't deposit the currency with the banks, they would lose that wealth that they held, because they would not be able to use that currency to make any purchases after that. If they deposited in the banks, they would reveal themselves. That was the understanding. And in the process, the tax authorities would know who holds this currency, what kind of income they have, what kind of wealth they have, and then subsequently it could be ensured that more of them would be made to pay the taxes. So for the holders of currency, there were basically two options. And the fact that more than 99% of the currency came back, which is something that we knew later, that itself showed you something about what was the calculations that those who were depositing the money making. Because they had basically two options before them. So anyone holding money which had not been revealed, its source had not been revealed, or it was illegal money, and therefore anyone who faced this thing, that situation that either you lose the wealth or you put it into the bank and risk losing your anonymity and being caught by the tax authorities. If this was the choice that was there before anyone holding illegal cash, they would exercise one or either of the two choices based on this rationale that I've set out here in the right-hand side of this table. So if I have money, I put it into a bank. If I don't put it into the bank, I will lose that amount of wealth. So it's a one-time loss that I will suffer. I will compare that with what I'm likely to lose if I put it into the bank and reveal the fact that I hold it to the tax authorities. So I will have to pay additional taxes in future or some penalties for now as a result of revealing the fact that I am holding that particular amount of currency. If the expected future loss for me would be higher than the wealth that I could lose right now, I would prefer to just suffer that loss and not deposit it in the bank. I would deposit it in the bank only if I was fairly certain that the future costs that or penalties that this might result in will be actually less than the wealth I would lose by not depositing it in the banks. And the fact that 99% of the currency came back into the banks meant that all holders of illegal cash almost universally opted for the second decision and therefore adopted the second rationale. And I would think that those who do these things of evading taxes, who are part of the shadow economy, are generally pretty smart about money matters. And are not likely to have taken this decision to deposit everything foolishly. And the evidence that they were right is there before us. Where is the so-called contraction of the shadow economy that should have happened? Because the contraction of the shadow economy, the clearest evidence you should have found of that was an increase in the tax revenues coming to the government. But what do we see? What we actually see is that the tax revenue that is coming to the government, which is both direct taxes and indirect taxes, and we had another measure taken subsequently, which was also supposed to have the same effect, which is the introduction of GST, has resulted in exactly the opposite. The only way in which partially that effect has been hidden or concealed is by increasing reliance after 2014-15 on taxes on petrol and diesel. It's those taxes, because that's the easiest thing to do, raise the excise duties or impose a cess, is those taxes that have somehow kept the total tax revenue in check. Even that has not been sufficient to prevent the tax to GDP ratio dipping in the last few years. And if you leave out the POL taxes and you leave out the GST compensation that has to be paid to states for their loss of revenue, what you find is that, at least as far as central taxes you can see, the taxes to GDP ratio is actually significantly lower now than it was before demonetization. And of course, 2020-21 you can say is COVID year, but 2019-20 was not COVID year. And much before the COVID year, you had this effect becoming visible, and you clearly, there is absolutely no evidence to say that the tax revenues and therefore the expected benefits to people in terms of greater expenditures by the government on their welfare, that promise has clearly remained not only unfulfilled, less than fulfilled. So the evidence therefore would indicate that almost nothing in terms of what was its supposed objectives of demonetization have been achieved. If anything has happened, it is indicative, the evidence is indicative of it being the reverse of what was anticipated or stated to be the rationale for the demonetization exercise. But that's as far as I think most people are aware of the fact that in terms of that effect, the thing has been very limited. But with regard to the question of the second point that I wish to raise about the constitutional and legal aspect of the thing, The RBI Act, the section 2 of section 26 clause 2 is what was evoked to withdraw the legal tender status of banks, of these notes. But what is legal tender? Legal tender question comes up in a world in which you have fiat money, which is something is money because the law says it is money, and the legal tender status of a note is simply this, that you cannot refuse to accept that as a means of settlement of payments. The law forbids you from rejecting something that is legal tender as in a process of settlement of payment. So if I go and pay someone with that legal tender, person cannot say that no, I do not accept it because I don't want this, I want something else or anything like that. That's the meaning of the legal tender status, and the legal tender status becomes crucial or important for currency when you have something serving as money whose intrinsic value is less than its value as money. And because it would be very costly to have the amount of money that one requires for transactions with things that are of equal value. So if you were to use gold of 500 rupees to make every 500 rupee payment, you would need a very large amount of gold in order for that to do that. So legal tender status, and that's the reason why everyone cannot be allowed to make money, in a sense, produce money or currency. So that legal tender status is important for the operation of currency as money. Now, yes, the RBI Act did say that the government could withdraw the legal tender status of some currency. The question is, if you withdraw the legal tender status of something, does that mean that the use of that in the means of settlement of payments is illegal? Which is the way it was interpreted. You were not allowed to make payments with the outlawed 500 and 1000 rupee notes, except in certain designated cases. But suppose two parties were to engage in a transaction in which both are willing to settle the transaction with something as anything else. Suppose two people, one person in the village gives grain to someone, and then in exchange for that something else, some other asset that the person has is given in exchange. That's not illegal. So if two parties in a transaction are willing to accept something as money which can be used to settle payments, is that something that can be outlawed by the government? Does withdrawal of legal tender status amount to that? Is a question. And this question about whether people are permitted to accept as settlement of payments things that they mutually agree on will of course have implications for things like the cryptocurrencies and all, and whether the state or government can interfere in that particular activity or not. So that's one side of the legal question, which makes the legality or constitutionality and the interpretation of this particular clause important for more than the demonetization exercise. Okay. The other aspect of this legality is this, that legal tender means also comes with a promise. So you look at any particular note, the RBI chairman signs on that with a statement, I promise to pay the bearer the sum of so much. Now, the only time you were actually required to live up to that promise is when you withdraw the legal tender status of something that you have yourself issued earlier. I will not come and exchange a 500 rupee note which is valid. I will not come to you as the RBI and say, please give me 500 rupees. The RBI will say, you already have it in your hand. I will come to you when something you've issued to me which said it is worth 500 rupees. You've now said it is no longer worth 500 rupees. I will then come and say, you promised to pay me the sum of 500 rupees. It's written there, printed, signed. You have a legal commitment to make, you made. You please give me the 500. The question here is that when the legal tender status is withdrawn, can the government and the RBI refuse to immediately provide the alternative legal tender, as it happened during the demonetization case? It's not obvious to me from this clause in the RBI Act that the government has the right to say, I will meet this commitment 6 months later, 4 months later, or only to this extent. That they have the right to renege on that promise to pay that particular sum. Now, this becomes relevant because this demonetization exercise means that when you withdraw the legal tender status of currency and you do not provide the alternative immediately, then the legitimately earned income of someone is also temporarily taken away, because if it has been earned in the form and being held in the form of currency, you are not being able to use it to meet your requirements or needs. And insofar as it happened, and insofar as you are doing it for currency, it has an added implication, because who are the ones who are most dependent on currency transactions? The ones who are unlikely to have any kind of a backup. So potentially devastating effects on the lives of people can take place and did take place as a result of that decision. Does the state or the government have the power or the authority to do that? Is a question. We still do not have a clear answer in terms of what does the Indian Constitution say. Those who have to interpret it have not yet given us an interpretation of whether the state has the power to do this or not. Now, you can of course see that something like the lockdown was another decision of a similar nature, where the government took a decision without accepting any obligation legally of addressing the devastating consequences of that on those who are not in any way guilty of any wrongdoing and therefore are being punished for that. So lockdown is of course one case in which you can see a similar process at work, and whether the question of the legality of the decision is relevant there. More broadly, what one is talking about is whether, or a particular way of reading legal provisions where you say that the government has the power to do X, but you are unmindful of any limits or constraints that the same framework, legal framework, may impose on those decisions. Where you are unmindful of any obligations that go with that particular power to take a decision. It's a particular way of reading the powers that are vested in government in the Constitution. Is that correct in terms of what are the provisions of the Indian Constitution? Is a question. And this question comes up not only in the case of decisions like lockdown and demonetization, which have devastating economic effects on people. It also comes up in the context of decisions like the abrogation of Article 370 and the lockdowns imposed after that in Kashmir. So, what are the boundaries of the state's exercise of powers that are vested in it in the Constitution? Are there certain boundaries to that or not, which are clear and specified? Is a question that I think still remains unanswered or unaddressed. It came up first with the demonetization exercise, but this is a question that has come up repeatedly in several decisions that have been taking place since. And the parallels between the demonetization decision and the lockdown are too obvious. So many people have seen the parallels. Okay. The fact that it was announced at short notice, the fact that no attempt was made to address the predictable crisis it was going to create for people. Those parallels are seen where you have seen decisions being taken by governments which have far-reaching immediate implications for people. Whether there are boundaries that constrain the state in any way in there or not is a question that I think still came up with the demonetization episode, which remains to be addressed. But we of course know that the demonetization effect also had certain economic consequences. Broadly speaking, you had a problem that is obvious here, that since the demonetization episode, there is evidence of a continuous process of deceleration of the Indian economy. So annually, if you see, but this is you are getting even with the new GDP series introduced in 2015, which has been controversial because many people have argued that it is something that overestimates the growth of the Indian economy. So that was true even up to 2016-17. After 2016-17, because of demonetization, because of GST, and then of course because of lockdown and COVID, because you reasonably expect that what is called the unorganized sector of the economy would have been taken an exceptional hit because of these three kind of shocks that were inflicted on the economy. And you do not have a way of measuring that exceptional impact on a regular basis. It is likely that the deceleration after 2016-17 is of an even greater order than you see from the official statistics. There's a reasonable basis for arguing that, but even with that series, you can see that deceleration, and you similarly see this as far as quarterly GDP was concerned. Even before the COVID effect struck, you had this particular process of deceleration taking place in the economy. And this deceleration has got upstaged by the effects of COVID and lockdown, and the quest for recovering from that often leads to forgetting that there was a process of there was a problem in the economy that was there even before. But demonetization, of course, was one episode which contributes to that trend. It's not the only one, but it's also not the beginning of the crisis. So you have a longer term story if you look at the entire decade in which demonetization comes in the second half, early part of the second half of the decade. Demonetization could be said to be the first of a series of successive shocks that were administered to an economy that was already facing difficulties in terms of the sustenance of a process of economic expansion. So if you for example, look at the industrial sector, you see that not from the beginning of the decade till the end, there's been never any period of rapid growth of the manufacturing sector in India. It's been stagnating for the entire decade. You know that the investment ratio, the proportion of GDP that is invested, has been falling. Okay, for the the whole period since the global crisis and the beginning of the decade. And the same is true of India's trade. So you know that this decade has been different from the previous one, where you've seen a reversal of certain trends, which you normally associate with a process of expansion or growth in the economy. Which is the reason why people say that the GDP figures overestimate the growth that is taking place in the economy. Okay. You also know that the employment crisis in the economy goes back a long way. That the employment that is being generated within the economy as a proportion of the total population has been falling. In fact, the employment level itself has been stagnating, almost unchanged for over a decade. So the crisis is not new. The process of development of the Indian economy post-liberalization saw in the previous decade one phase in which you had this very high rates of growth. But since the global crisis, and particularly since the beginning of this decade, you have seen a process where this particular process of expansion has been floundering, and there has been a kind of crisis that has afflicted the economy. So demonetization should then be seen as a first of a series of shocks to what was an already flagging economy. So an economy that was already in crisis, okay, was a crisis that hit different segments of the economy at different points of time and in different ways. For large part of the population, the crisis was there even in the period of high growth, because employment was even then limited, earnings from employment were even then limited. But gradually, you have had other sectors of the economy also facing a crisis. You have even now the corporate sector facing a crisis that it is not able to any longer. Its profits cannot grow in the same way that it had grown in the previous decade. And that's the reason why the investment by even the corporate sector had tapered off in this particular decade. So demonetization did not produce the crisis, but it was the first of a series of shocks that was administered in the second half of the decade to the economy. GST was another, lockdown was another, and in many of these shocks, there is a particular characteristic, which is that they were not, by shock one is meaning that they came in a sense exogenously. They were not spontaneous outcomes of the working of the economy. The government took specific decisions which resulted in that particular shock being administered to the economy. So there was already a crisis that the process of expansion was facing, and on top of that, these shocks were administered, which has only aggravated the crisis. But the demonetization, I think, now can be looked at as also the first of a series of decisions which had a certain character, which is you take a decision in which its dramatic value, the ability to show it as a bold and decisive move, an ability, a decision which has the character of being amenable to being presented as bold, decisive decision of a leader, a bold and decisive leader who wants to take the country forward. The precedence to decision or the value given to that nature of decisions at the expense of not only whether it is an effective decision in relation to the purpose it is supposedly for, but also with callous disregard for the impact it might have, adverse impact, real impact it might have on those to whom that message is being actually addressed. That demonetization was the first of a series of decisions where you see this proclivity to decision making of this kind. It was not, so demonetization, and particularly you can see the repeat of that process in the lockdown. Exactly the same kind of thing was repeated in the lockdown so many years apart, which means that even if there is some internal questioning of the adverse effects of demonetization, it did not in any way affect the approach to the decision on the lockdown. Again, it was a similar kind of decision where, again, it had a similar kind of consequences. Now, whether those to whom the message was addressed were taken in by the message or accepted the genuineness of that message and overlooked the effect it had on them is a separate question. But at the level of analysis, you can say that anyone who was, if the government was truly concerned about what the effects on people would be, the hesitation that would have been there in taking decisions of this kind would have been far greater than what was shown. So there is an additional element to decision making that has the demonetization exercise indicated a certain transition to certain kind of decision making approach, which has only aggravated the economic crisis. It is not actually, the decisiveness and boldness have not been able to address the root causes of the crisis. So the macroeconomic performance, in a sense, has not necessarily improved. But there was an additional element to that particular set of that to the demonetization decision, the decision of the lockdown, decision on the GST, that despite the adverse economic effects on people, okay, it was also reflecting or went with approach to the question of management of the economy, in which the decisions themselves, what is their impact? Their impact is to weaken the already weak expansionary momentum within the economy. Of course, the loss of the expansionary momentum in the economy brings no benefits to those who did not benefit even when the economy was growing rapidly. But the loss of the expansionary momentum means that almost everyone in the economy, even those who dominate that economy, are going to suffer. So the opportunities that those who have benefited most from the process of growth in the Indian economy in the last few decades, in particular the corporate sector in India and big business, which has benefited immensely from this particular growth, there is a transition now taking place with which this demonetization and subsequent decisions also seem to be associated. That you have, as the expansionary momentum of the economy is lost, and the scope for growth through expansion or accumulation through expansion are becoming increasingly scarce. There is a tendency to encroach upon and bring other segments of the economy which are till now not dominated by the corporate sector within the ambit of the corporate sector, which is of course taking place at the expense of those for whom that particular activity has so far been their source of sustenance. So the whole story about increasing formalization of the economy is essentially, in my view, that. And this kind of an approach towards encroachment goes well with things like GST, demonetization, because you are ultimately hitting at the basis on which certain segments of the economy sustain, okay, and are able to survive even in an economy which is otherwise dominated by corporate capital. So demonetization was the first of a series of decisions which was indicating of this shift where the policy framework itself is not able to ensure an expansionary process in the economy. In fact, it aggravates the absence of that expansionary process by hitting through these series of measures, these shocks being administered to the economy in crisis. But it is consistent with an approach of increasing encroachment by corporate capital on larger and larger segments of the economy. You could look at even things like the agricultural laws and all as parts of that same story. So this is the, and of course, there's a larger politics associated with it. I won't have time to go into that, but demonetization could be said to be indicator of this shift taking place in the second half of this particular decade, and which is why one has seen not just demonetization, but several other things. So several other things may have happened which have led to a demonetization in a sense being pushed to the past, but historically one can see that it was perhaps the first major indication of this shift that was under way. So the whole story about so-called formalization of the economy essentially is about this parasitic encroachment rather than about creating opportunities for economic expansion, opportunities for employment. Okay, and you already have a reality where the corporate sector has come to occupy a very large segment of the economy, but of course, it doesn't either employ directly a very large portion of the Indian labor force, nor does it pay those whom it employs a lot. So you already have the private corporate sector is a very large segment. There is a public sector, corporate sector, which is also there. If you have the completion of this process of privatization, roughly about half the economy will be in the hands of the private corporate sector. That's the scale at which this expansion has happened. And within the corporate sector, of course, it is not a very large number of companies, but a very small handful of companies, a very small handful of groups which dominate, as this table indicates. Almost 56% of the profits are cornered by just a handful of companies amongst the lakhs of companies which are registered and which file income tax returns in this country. It's a colossal level of concentration that has already happened in the economy. And it's the extension of that with which one can say that the demonetization decision can be tied, even if it's not a very conscious strategy in this direction, but the thrust in that direction is something from which you can understand how decisions like demonetization actually come. Within the corporate sector, also, as I said, the part that goes to employees is a very small part. The bulk of it goes as surplus to mostly profit, but those who earn rent and interest also. Very little goes to employees, even though one segment of corporate sector employees have very high salaries, but they don't constitute even the bulk of the employment in the corporate sector. The bulk of that employment is at pretty low wages because that's the level of wages that prevails in the entire economy. The average, we describe it as a cheap labor economy in which large segments of the population can only find work at low wages, no matter which part of the economy they work in, and the returns to laboring activity typically are very low. That's that's a major part of the reason why expansion cannot be sustained, because the market is too narrow in India. Large parts of the population are not able to provide an expanding market, and it kind of feeds back onto them in an economy where increasingly the corporate sector is encroaching on larger and larger parts of the economy. This feeds back onto them in the form of even more limited employment generation by the corporate sector for this large. So you have this large concentration and not even the possible benefit of high employment accruing to people. And it's that thrust and direction rather than economic expansion that is the thrust or the direction, you can say, since demonetization. you can observe a distinct push in that particular kind of direction. That's a longer story with which one can link demonetization, a process or a history that is not yet over. In that sense, demonetization is a ghost that still walks. Thank you.
Thank you, Surajit. It was a very interesting and very comprehensive lecture. We have a few questions for you in the chat box. Maybe I can read them out to you. And so there was a question about demonetization not being the only reason why the tax revenues are low. Some of it you've responded, but would you like to take that? There was this big, what do you say, corporate tax cut which was given, and there were other measures. So the fall in the tax revenues should not be only attributed to demonetization, is a question which has been asked. That's one. And also, yeah, could you respond to that, and then we'll take others from.
Okay, I'll respond. Okay, so thank you for that question. Yes, of course, it is true that demonetization is not the only reason why the tax rates are lower. And of course, the larger macroeconomic context itself plays a part. But demonetization, plays its role in the making of that economic context, okay, including the slowdown in response to which the corporate tax cuts came. Demonetization also, if it was something that would have had the effect that it was supposed to have, what was claimed will have, should have compensated for other adverse effects on revenue. And the tax cut in any case came only in 2019-20. It didn't come before that. But you saw the effect on the revenues even before. Even before you saw that. The point I'm trying to make is simply this, that if you had any significant contraction of the so-called shadow economy, if you had such a contraction of the shadow economy, then somewhere or the other it would have shown up in terms of some effect on taxes. You do not see that particular effect. Okay, so there is no evidence that you have had that particular effect. That's all I was trying to say. But of course, there are other factors that work in explaining why the revenues are lower. No doubt about that. But those who are responsible for those factors are also those who were responsible for demonetization. So the demonetization cannot be excused because those other factors are there.
A second set of questions is related to now that we have the 5th year of demonetization. We had, I think, the Home Minister and some economists who are aligned to government coming up with figures that there is more formalization of the economy thanks to demonetization. So, meaning, given all this, how are they saying this, and is there any basis for what they are saying? What are they hiding? Is it jugglery, or is there some meaning to what they are saying? Is the next question.
So, as I was trying to say at the end, what you are getting is a process in which the so-called formal big corporate sector is encroaching on what used to be the domain of the so-called unorganized sector in the economy. But this is a parasitic encroachment. This is not what you would call formalization of the economy. Okay. And this is an encroachment which is not converting the large part of employment in India into so-called formal employment. This is not a process which is even absorbing a large part of the workforce in India. So what the large part of the workforce which till now has faced a situation where, on the one hand, it is either compelled or forced to seek employment in what is called the unorganized sector because they don't have employment opportunities in the organized sector. And the large number of people who are employed in the organized sector but are forced to accept extremely unfair terms because you have a very elastic labor regime that is created by the condition where so many people, there's such a vast labor reserve that is available that can be used. So they are subjected to what is called informalization of employment even within the formal sector. Now, is there anything in this process which is changing that, or the process that you're seeing is aggravating? Is the employment opportunities being increased? Are more workers able to get better jobs? More people being able to get better jobs with better benefits in terms of rights they enjoy as employees? None of that you're getting. Instead, you're getting an aggravation of the very same problem which results in this so-called high level of informalization in the economy, if you wish to use that particular term. So that is not formalization. So in the name of formalization, what is actually happening is this encroachment. And the terms on which labor is being engaged in even this process, where often it is not even allowed to call it, they are not even allowed to call themselves workers. And the nature of the terms on which they are being engaged in this activity, the few who do get engaged. Okay. None of these are indicating what one would understand by a process of formalization, which is centered on what is happening to the world of those who labor. This is big corporate capital encroaching on and taking over larger and larger segment of economic activities at the expense of those they employ and those who they don't employ, both.
Then there are two questions related. One is of the kind of hyperactivity of the stock market at the moment, the new IPOs coming in, lots of money going into the stock market. And also, would you think that a lot of unaccounted money left the country post demonetization due to this? These are two questions related but slightly separate. The question of currency, meaning money leaving the country illegally to tax havens and so on. And the other one is the activity in the stock market with regard to new IPOs and stuff.
Okay, so let me take the second first. As far as the question of money being siphoned off abroad to tax havens or in order to evade taxes, whatever had happened before demonetization, obviously demonetization could have no effect on that because it was not wealth held in India in the form of Indian rupees, or 500 or 1,000 rupee notes. So demonetization couldn't have possibly had any effect on that. Neither does demonetization have any effect on the ability of the rich and the wealthy to move their money like that. What demonetization in fact did was to shift attention away from where the real game of tax evasion happens to a mythical thing that, okay, since there are people who, yes, there may be segments of the economy where no taxes are paid, but that doesn't mean that that's where the bulk of the tax evasion is happening. There might be the use of cash in the process of evading of tax, preference for use of cash as opposed to transactions through accounts where records are created. But that doesn't mean that that's where the bulk of the tax evasion actually takes place. If you have an economy in which 55 to 56% of the income generated annually in the economy accrues to less than 10% of the population, then it must be the case that that's where the real story of evasion happens. And going after them, if you do not wish to make that the focus, something like demonetization may help you to focus on those whom people may immediately see as the beneficiaries of tax evasion, because they can't possibly see how the big players actually do it. That's not part of their direct daily experience. So demonetization in that sense, I don't see it having had any effect on the ways in which of tax evasion, including taking money out of India and putting it into assets abroad. That happened before, that has happened, would have happened later. Demonetization did not have any impact on that. And people didn't take the currency holdings out, obviously, because all of it came back to the banks. We know that now. 99% of the notes that were there came back. So it's not that they were converted into something else and taken out of India. They just came back to the banks. So as far as that is concerned, I don't think demonetization itself had any kind of impact other than the fact that it focused attention or diverted attention from some of these real issues with regard to the question of tax evasion. With regard to the question of the stock market, that's of course not directly linked to the question of demonetization, though it might also kind of partially may have some kind of partial link with it. Of course, if you have an economic context in which a lot of liquidity is there in the system, okay, where money is available and flowing through the system, as long as it is money to be used in the business of making money. But you have a context where making money through production becomes difficult because there isn't enough money to buy the products, that goods or services that you may produce in the process of production. That in a sense describes the global economic context of today, where several people, and this is particularly true in India, so large portion of population which had already problem of very limited ability to buy is in an even worse situation today. Their ability to purchase is even more limited than it was earlier. But in the name of stimulating the economy, globally and to an extent even in India, you have liquidity in the form of being available, made available in order to supposedly stimulate economic activity. So there's a lot of money floating around which is seeking opportunities for making more money. The opportunities for doing that through production, making money through production, are more limited because all the money is in the wrong end of that circuit. There isn't any money at the other end to buy any of the goods and services. So then the money tends to go into financial markets, into stock markets, and you get a systemic condition for a period of time in which you can have this kind of booming stock markets, which has no relationship with either the actual real economic conditions or the at least medium-term prospects of the real economy.
We are kind of running out of time. We should be taking one last question. There is a question on UP elections and so on. I am not sure whether this refers to the UP elections that are soon coming or the UP elections just after demonetization. I presume that the question is about the UP elections which happened just after demonetization. So the question is, how did demonetization affect politically immediately after UP elections? What happened? What is your view?
Okay. No, so as I said, there is in all these decisions, there is a clear political element in which the decisions and the fact that these decisions can be presented in a certain way as the bold decisions which are interest to the people, as decisions which involve some short-term pain for long-term gain. The same messaging was there with demonetization, the same messaging was there with lockdown. And this placing of responsibility on people that if you are truly committed to yourself and to the future of this nation, you accept this sacrifice. There is that side to it. And there is on the other side, the actual effects that you get on the lives of people. Now, there are ways and means by which that particular message is got across effectively. Of course, that has to then find acceptance given the fact that there are certain consequences that people face immediately in their lives and some kind of crisis that people face immediately in their lives. Now, in different circumstances and different individuals, how these two sides of the process play itself out in shaping the response would be different. What we can say is that the messaging was certainly adequate enough to not threaten the electoral prospects of the ruling part, the central government, the ruling party at the center in the UP elections that took place after demonetization. So it didn't necessarily have that kind of a threatening effect, but it doesn't mean that it did not invoke any kind of response. But a response or even an anger on one specific issue and how it translates into decisions on voting in an election where you have to choose between some given set of alternatives. And you're not always choosing yes or no. You choose between some given set of alternatives. That's a complex story. I'm not sure I'm even competent to address all of that. All I can say is that, of course, it's true that the messaging, which is as I said, that's an important element of that decision. So it's a peculiar combination of a completely callous disregard for what's going to happen to the lives of people, enormously callous disregard for what's going to happen to people, with this kind of a messaging to the same people. So it's an extremely cynical kind of thing that you can actually think of winning over the support of people, find a way of winning over support of people by hitting them and hitting them very hard. That is, I think, one of the characteristics of the demonetization decision, which is reflected in several other decisions also.
On that note, I think we should end this very interesting lecture. I thank Professor Surajit Mazumdar for having come here and spoken to us. And despite all the problems we had with the internet, we still managed to have this very interesting lecture and discussion after. On behalf of my colleagues and others here, I also thank the audience for staying on till the very end, listening and participating in the discussion. Thank you very much. We look forward to your participation in the future events. We will organize interesting events time and again. We look forward to seeing you there. Yeah. Goodbye. Good night.
Thank you.